Hello to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much to the Indian Institute of Technology for inviting me to become a distinguished visiting professor, which was a great pleasure to accept. And I would also like, tonight, I would like to say hello to our viewers from the Krasno Global Events Series at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And of course, to all the viewers from the Indian Institute of Technology in Mumbai. We have had the presidential election, the 2020 presidential election last night. The outcome is still somewhat unclear, I should say. But what we have learned already, that the polls were wrong again, and that many of the hopes of the Democratic Party and Democratic politicians have been disappointed. The outcome of the election clearly means it's not a clear repudiation of President Trump, and also his way of policy, his conservative way of policy, the Republican and what the Republican Party of today stands for has not been clearly repudiated. In fact, the Republican Party seems to have won seats in the House of Representatives. They probably can also maintain their hold on the Senate, and the race for the White House is still open, but it's a very tight race. Biden may just sneak in, or Trump may just manage to stay in power. But it is clear that it is not a decisive victory for either party. This means that the country, the United States, will remain polarized, will remain deeply divided for the next 4 years. Whoever will occupy the White House in the end, American politics will really be deeply divided. So the hope of many, including myself, that Trumpism would be repudiated clearly, that we can say that the United States is really a power interested in the globe and in international affairs, in globalization, has not been clearly confirmed. That only what I just said seems to apply for, let's say, 50% of the American public, but not too many more. Though Biden clearly has won, like Hillary Clinton before him 4 years ago, Biden has won the popular vote with something like 2.5 to 3 million votes, again, like Hillary Clinton, but the Electoral College outcome is by no means clear. That means we will see, in whatever form it may eventually take, we will see more of America first. It will be a strong America first policy if Trump manages to get into the White House, or it will be a softer, maybe an America first light version if Biden manages to get into the White House. But the forces in American politics are clearly focused on America itself. I cannot see that the United States will go back to that globalized power which we had under Barack Obama, under George W. Bush, and before. Trumpism is still with us, and the country is still deeply divided. And that is not what the outside world wanted. The outside world wanted clear American leadership, particularly, of course, America's allies. People in Europe were hoping that America would go back to being a responsible, benign, constructive leader of the Western world. And therefore, it was always assumed that a President Biden would be a force for restoration, that he would be a president of restoration who would redo redo of what President Trump did in the last 4 years, particularly, of course, focusing on America itself, neglecting alliances, neglecting international organizations. This now must be questioned whether that will happen at all. There is one hope we will have if President Trump manages to sneak back into office. There's one hope that in his second term, President Trump would perhaps become more open, more constructive than he has been during the last 4 years. And the model here would be President Reagan in his second term. In his first term, Reagan also was highly conservative, highly focused on American domestic politics, on his tax reforms, on making America strong again in an economic sense, and also by being very hardline on the Soviet Union at the time, and also of being quite unilateral towards America's allies. But in his second term, we saw a much more constructive Ronald Reagan, a Ronald Reagan who entered into negotiations with the Soviet Union, which in the end, together with Gorbachev's help, led to the end of the Cold War. Whether or not we can accept such a more constructive, more global, more outward-looking policy from Donald Trump must be questioned, however. There is no indication so far that Trump has actually an agenda and a clear schedule for his second term, that there is something in his mind with which he wants to go down in history, which will define his legacy. Of course, we could very much be surprised, but at the moment, there is no indication for that. In fact, when we go to his speech last night, where he prematurely announced that he had won the election and that the counting should stop because clearly he had won, otherwise he would go to the Supreme Court. That was not based in reality. That was simply what he was in his mind, was wishful thinking. Of course, the counting will continue, the counting will be completed, but that utterance last night was, of course, political theater, but it was political theater with very much an authoritarian bent. Therefore, we cannot conclude that Donald Trump has really changed his spots, that he has decided to embark on a much more constructive policy, be it domestic or foreign policy for the next 4 years. If Biden managed to become president, we could certainly expect a more multilateral and a less unilateral policy. However, Biden would not have the strong support of the American public. As I said, half of the American public is actually a follower of President Trump and everything he stands for. So the election outcome, even if Biden manages to get into the White House, has already weakened Biden. And the House of Representatives will be less democratic than it was before, and the Senate may still be dominated by Mitch McConnell and the Republican majority. So Biden will have to prove that he is no softie. He will not be able to embark on typical democratic policies, as he will have his hands tied, both by the political scene, but also by, of course, the American voters. And that means we will only see a slightly more unilateral, a slightly more multilateral policy by the United States. So Biden will perhaps be less of a restoration president than many of us had hoped before the election. That also will have important implications for both American domestic and American foreign policy. Regarding American domestic policy, just briefly, I know this talk is mostly about America's foreign relations, but regarding America's domestic policy for the next 4 years, under Biden, I think the democratic norms and conventions and rules would be much more observed than they have been and will be under a President Trump. This, of course, is good. Biden is a deeply dyed-in-the-wool Democrat who has been in office in some way or other. It has been in politics for almost 50 years. And he, of course, embodies what American democracy stands for and has embodied that for almost half a century. So this is very good indeed. But when we turn to immigration policy, for example, then Biden will find it impossible to simply go back to what it was before. There will be a slight opening to immigrants. Certainly political asylum will not be radically turned back as it has been the case under Trump. However, Biden will also have a much more selective policy than probably was the case before Trump. Regarding work visas, which is particularly important for India, for example, but also for many European countries, for many other countries around the globe, including China and Vietnam, and many other countries whose workers and students and professionals would like to come to the United States to work for as engineers and students, to work for Google and Facebook and Apple and other high-tech companies. Probably under President Biden, H-1B visas, work visas for professionals, also J-1 visas for students and similar visas would probably be made available in a more generous way, but not quite as generously as before, I believe. So immigration policy will be affected by who goes to the White House, I believe. Under Trump, we can see the continuation of a very hardline immigration policy. That is what he has always promised his supporters, and I can't see that probably that in a second term, President Trump would go back on that. Regarding environmental policy and race relations, I think we would also see a change under President Biden. He would rejoin the Paris Climate Treaty. He would certainly do something about fracking in the United States, about the opening up of Alaska for oil drillings, for example, for coastal oil drilling, as has been attempted by President Trump and his supporters. So that, I think, would be much more progressive than what we have seen under President Trump. Also regarding race relations, I think we would see a much more, at least an attempt to be more integrating than has been the case under President Trump. Also regarding battling the COVID-19 epidemic and pandemic, Biden can of course be expected to be more constructive. He would ask Americans clearly to wear masks, to do social distancing. He would remind his people all the time of the importance of these measures. But also I think Biden would be, or any president who comes in, even President Trump in his second term, would be quite fortunate, because we can expect a vaccine in the early months of next year, and a wide distribution of the vaccine, be it with the military or without the military, by probably May, June of next year at the latest. And that, of course, would help any new president to get that epidemic under control. So either of these two men would be fortunate in this respect. Until then, of course, the pandemic will take its course in the United States, and if nothing is done, as is almost the case today, if no precautions are taken, or very limited precautions by many people in the United States, then we will see further deaths, further mortalities, further rise of infection rates. But eventually the pandemic will probably get under control with the help of a vaccine, rather than with the help of whoever sits in the White House. Under Trump, we can expect a more isolationist and a more unilateral policy on the whole. And that means that many allies of the United States will be disappointed if Trump goes back into office. Under President Biden, there will be a sigh of relief, particularly among America's allies. But Biden, as I said before, cannot afford to be seen as a softie, to simply go back to the Obama years and realize the policy of Obama, like having Obama, a third term for Obama. So he will also insist on the European allies, for example, to spend more on defense. He will, of course, be supportive of NATO in principle, but he will not allow the Europeans to get away with not spending 2% of their GDP, as had been agreed many years before. Transatlantic relations under a Biden administration will still improve, because Biden will be more constructive, he will be more predictable, he will be a more stable president. Also, his Secretary of State, his national security advisor, will be more dyed-in-the-wool globalists who really believe that America should be a global leader and should be the leader, certainly, of the transatlantic alliance. And I think that will make a difference in style and tone, though not always regarding the substance of America's policy. What also can be expected is that the United States and the European allies will agree on policies like climate change, the rejoining, as I said, the rejoining of the United States of the Paris Climate Treaty, but they will also probably agree on a joint policy towards Iran and under what conditions the Iranian nuclear deal can be revived and how the United States can rejoin that treaty. That will not be a matter, of course, that will not be done without conditions being put down, which Iran will have to fulfill. But at least there will be a way forward for Iran. There will be a way forward for that deal to survive. And I think that is certainly much more than could be said what would be the policy of President Trump. As we know, he withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal, which was concluded under the Obama administration in 2015. Trump withdrew in 2018, and he has no intention to rejoin. He has talked about negotiating a new deal, but so far no effort has been made by the administration to do something like that. And when you listen to all the hostility coming out of the White House and out of the American government towards Iran, then I cannot see that that will actually be happen anytime at all. So under Biden, I think we would see an attempt to be more constructive towards Iran. The same would apply, I think, to policy towards China and Russia. I think a Biden administration would try to forge more of a common united front with the Europeans regarding how to deal with Russia and China. Because essentially both sides of the Atlantic agree what is wrong with Chinese policy, how China should be engaged, and how what can be done to improve relations. And I think that hostility, which we now see coming out of the White House, will be tempered by President Biden. Biden will not be a softie. He will not just go back to the policy before Trump, but I believe he will be more open to a constructive relationship with both Russia and China. I will say a little bit about that in a minute, but just let me say that that dialogue, which recently was inaugurated, that dialogue between Europe and the United States on China, that probably would be continued, because that was also enforced under the Obama administration, so at a slightly lower level. And that is something which both sides have agreed upon is a good idea, to have a united front towards the foes and rivals of the Western alliance. And I cannot see that Biden would not continue that dialogue. And that dialogue has been very much approved of by the Europeans. A word about Russia. The Trump administration actually has been quite tough on Russia. It is Trump's personal attitude to President Putin which has always been questioned. That the United States had severely criticized Russian policy towards Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, has also severely criticized Russian activities in Syria and in the Middle East, and Russia's disinformation campaign, the poisoning of Russian opposition politicians outside the country and within Russia. But President Trump's personal relationship with Putin has always been questioned, and he has behaved in a very, let's say, almost subservient way to Putin. Certainly he has never really taken him on. He has never really disbelieved him when Putin told him or gave him information. And that probably can be expected to continue. But the American administration as such, Pompeo, for example, who normally is quite a loyal follower of Trump, but Pompeo has, and the State Department, has had quite a critical and skeptical policy towards Russia. Under Biden, we would see a continuation of that, plus we would see a much more skeptical attitude by the president towards the Russian president. And that leads me to China. And China is, of course, probably the dominating foreign policy problem for the United States. what to do with China, how to manage China, or as some hardliners say, how to contain China. It goes without saying, you cannot just contain another big rising power. There's nothing wrong with China's rise. It's quite understandable that once you free yourself from being a developing country, you become a technologically very advanced country, you become almost the biggest economic power in the world. Many countries, actually the majority of countries in the world, trade with you, and you are their largest trading partner. You are the third largest trading partner to that huge European market. You are a huge trading partner to the leading economy in the world, still the United States. And of course, you want to have a seat at the table. You don't want to be treated as a minor power. And this is totally understandable. And the United States needs to come to terms with that and needs to engage with China. However, China has the habit of trying to, let's say, take shortcuts. And these shortcuts consist of, for example, intellectual property theft. That has to be tackled. And I think that has been started by already the Obama administration, continued by, in a very assertive way, by the Trump administration. And I think it will be continued by any succeeding administration, be it Trump or Biden. And also other issues like lack of market access, reciprocity in market access, then China's assertive behavior, to put it kindly, in the South China Sea, or sometimes in other countries like African countries with the help of the Road and Belt and Road Initiative. All that has to be tackled, but that is not impossible. And I think a Biden presidency would try to embark on a much more constructive policy with China, but not a soft policy. But he would be more prepared to engage under certain conditions, under conditions of reciprocity and fairness, which of course have to be, the rules for that have to be put down. A Biden presidency would also engage more with China in the World Trade Organization, would hopefully reform that important organization with which we can't do. I think that the World Trade Organization is highly important for making sure that trade disputes, economic disputes can be regulated within an organizational form, and disputes can actually be resolved at the World Trade Organization court. And that is what it was there for, why it was created. So a Biden administration would have a more constructive attitude of engagement towards China. But I don't think they would be a pushover and would just give in to anything China suggests or does. And I think a Biden administration would also, as I indicated, rely more on a united front with the Europeans towards China, but also probably towards Russia. And that probably is a good idea for the Western camp, because it will strengthen the United States and the position of the United States. So I can see that the China policy, whether it's Biden or Trump, will be relatively similar, but not the same. Biden will probably embark on a reset policy towards both China and Russia. And here it really depends on both countries whether or not to accept that reset policy and also engage with the United States, or whether just to dismiss it and not to take it seriously. I've said in many interviews I've given, I've said the ball is in China's court. There is a willingness by every constructive and globally interested and engaged Western politician, be it European or American, to engage with China. Any reasonable politician doesn't want to contain China, doesn't want to isolate China, because it's impossible. You know, there's no point of doing that. But you also don't want to be taken for a ride. You don't want to be dominated, taken for granted, or, as the saying goes, taken for a ride, being exploited. And so China needs to realize that, and also needs to make concessions of a reasonable nature. No one expects China just to make concessions, while the West doesn't make concessions. It's a mutual game, and both sides need to come together and engage with each other. But there needs to be a serious will on both sides. You cannot expect only a new President Biden to make concessions and be constructive, while Xi Jinping and the Politburo and the Standing Committee of the Politburo just don't move. This is not possible. Both sides have to move. And the same, I would say, also applies to President Putin and Russia. Something needs to be done about Eastern Ukraine. That has been much condemned. Something needs to be done about Russia's disinformation campaigns. Something needs to be done about Russia's habit of poisoning their own politicians, their own spies, and trying to resolve domestic problems maybe in other countries. And hopefully a reset policy, which may happen in January 2020, will find approval by other countries and will find similar activities on the part of China and Russia. Regarding India, that is of course very interesting for our audience today. Regarding India, Trump's and Biden's policies will probably be similar, with Biden having a more open mind regarding all matters, immigration, visas, and work opportunities for Indian engineers, Indian professionals, Indian students in the United States. Prime Minister Modi is seen as a close friend of President Trump, and I think Trump would view Modi as one of his most trusted international partners. But international politics goes beyond sheer personalities. I cannot see that Biden, despite having a much more skeptical attitude to Prime Minister Modi's nationalism and Hinduism and everything he stands for in a also populist way, he is much more skeptical towards that entire approach. But he is still the Prime Minister of India. So a Biden administration, of course, would engage with such a long-standing American partner. Also here, the China factor comes in. Any American government would value India as a partner in taking on China in an economic and technological way. There's been an attempt by the Trump administration to draw India more into the Western camp than perhaps many Indian politicians actually want to. India, as you know, has traditionally been a non-aligned country, has non-aligned status, and there is a certain caution by Indian politicians to keep that sort of neutral status with a certain tendency towards the West, of course. And I think American policy will continue to try to bring India closer to the United States. That concept of the Indo-Pacific, which Trump has not invented but much popularized since 2017, 2018, that concept of the Indo-Pacific world, of course, sees India as a very strong part of that world. And I think that would be pushed further, whether there is Biden or Trump in the White House. So perhaps there might be greater personal friction between the leading leaders in both India and the United States if Biden came to power. But I cannot see that Indian-American relations would really be disrupted or would suddenly become much worse. In fact, the greater the problems with China, at least as they are perceived in the United States, the greater the problems with China, the more the United States will try to be on good terms with India. And I think, of course, vice versa. We all know about the clashes between India and China in the Himalaya. And of course, India also feels it needs partners, it needs support. And the United States is, of course, the obvious country to go to. This leaves the Middle East. And the Middle East is, as always, very difficult territory. Under Trump administration, I think we would see a somewhat different approach to India, to the Middle East. Trump, in general, has had a certain liking for strongmen in international politics. That applies to both European leaders like Hungary and Poland, but also to leaders in the Middle East like the Saudi Arabian Crown Prince bin Salman. The United States has been surprisingly close to Saudi Arabia, has become ever more supportive of Saudi Arabia, despite Saudi Arabia's terrible war in Yemen, despite all sorts of other shenanigans by the Crown Prince, which have been much condemned by many other politicians. The United States has often just looked away or downplayed it. I think under a new second Trump administration, we could continue to expect more of the same. Under Biden, we would see a much more skeptical attitude towards Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is not as needed as by the United States as much as before, because as Trump has not stopped emphasizing during the election campaign, the United States has become relatively oil independent. And that, of course, would still be the case under President Biden, whatever happens to the fracking industry in the United States. So Saudi Arabia is still an important country, strategically very important, also, of course, oil resource important, but perhaps not quite as important as only 5 or 10 years ago. And I think that you would see consequences being taken by the Biden administration. Regarding Israel, I think Biden would be as close and supportive of Israel and the basic policy it stands for as the Trump administration has been done. The Biden administration would push the Palestinian question much more, would hope to get a state for the Palestinians, would push more for a two-state solution, but it would not give up on Israel. And also in Israel, Netanyahu, the prime minister, seems to be on the way out, at least in the medium term, let's put it that way. And that, of course, would enable a Biden administration to go beyond Netanyahu, who is not very much liked in the Democratic Party, and really have a reset policy towards Israel as well, in a constructive and supportive way. So there would be some changes regarding the Middle East, but perhaps nothing too radical and too dramatic if Biden managed to come into office. Regarding Iran, I think we would see, as I said before, we would see a much greater attempt by Biden to integrate Iran again and to engage Iran again on certain conditions. And that, of course, one of these conditions is, of course, that Iran has to really stop and calm down its regional activities of a very unholy nature, supporting of various terrorist networks all over the Middle East and other geopolitically very disconcerting activities. So we can expect some changes regarding the Middle East under Biden's administration, but I would say nothing too dramatic. And that would be my general conclusion. Under a Biden administration, we will see less unilateralism. We will see a more multilateral approach to global politics. Also the attempt that the United States will go back to being the leader of the Western world, being the leader of the free world, as the US always proudly proclaims, to be really to remain the undisputed global leader. There will be a much greater attempt by a Biden administration to do that. And there will be a more of a policy of engagement, be it with allies like the Europeans, be it with rivals like China and Russia. But I don't think we will see a really radically transformed American policy. We would see a more engaged, a more constructive, a more multilateral foreign policy. But as I said at the beginning of my talk, the Biden administration would have to deal with a skeptical American public. 50%, I would say, or just under 50%, are not really interested in the wider world. They're not globalists. They don't support globalization. And you would have a Congress, both a House of Representatives and a Senate, where the Republicans will have a very, very strong voice. And that would also hold back any real dramatic and radical initiatives by Biden administration. And then a last word perhaps about Biden himself. Biden is, of course, a center person. He's a middle of the road person. He is not radical. Whatever Trump said during the election campaign, where he tried to paint Biden as a radical left, no one, I think, believes that. Biden has always been a center politician throughout his almost 50 years in power. And it can be expected that he would appoint advisors and ministers and a cabinet, which also reflects that kind of middle of the road attitude. I cannot see anyone who he might possibly appoint who is really radical and would try to change American foreign policy in any radical or dramatic way. So in the end, my overall conclusion would be that it probably is better for the United States, for American foreign policy and for the world if Biden manages to come into the White House. But people should not delude themselves that suddenly everything is great, everything will be hugely better, and we will have, going back to the world as they were 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. I think that kind of world is over. Biden will be more constructive, but he will, in the end, have to represent the American public, and the American public did not overwhelmingly vote for him or the Democrats in Congress. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Klaus. And we can have some questions from the audience. There are two ways in which people can ask questions. One is you can unmute yourself because it is a small group. We can have people, unmute themselves and ask the question, or you can put it in the chat box and we can, then Professor Klaus Larres can answer those questions.
Yes.
So the So the house, the platform is open for discussion and question answers. Thank you, Klaus.
Sure. If you would basically read out your question or ask your question aloud, that probably would be the easiest.
Yes, yes. May I request the audience to, take it from here? I don't know. Is there any provision in Zoom to raise the hand or something?
Yes, there is.
Yeah, please.
So thank you very much, Klaus. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask you about the emotional approach of Trump in comparison to Biden in world politics. Do you think it is would be as disturbing as it seems to many of us, many Europeans, certainly, as he treats other countries like European, but principally China, or will a similar politics by Trump and Biden be indifferent for China? I mean, is it a problem, the emotions, the undiplomatic way of
is
it a real problem, or is it only a problem for us in perception of the politics?
No, I think it is. I think, while really narrowly substance-wise, the difference between Biden and Trump would be limited. But in terms of tone, in terms of style, in terms of democratic basis, there would be a huge difference. And I think that would actually probably delude people into believing that American policy, substance-wise, has also changed more than it actually has. Biden cannot afford to be seen as a softie. And I think his ego wouldn't allow that either, but he cannot afford that regarding Congress and the American public. So he has to be tough. but he would also be more democratic in his basic principles. He would be, of course, less vulgar. I can't see he would tweet. Maybe some of his advisors occasionally would send out a tweet, but he wouldn't send out 40 tweets in the middle of the night because he can't sleep and gets annoyed about something by watching Fox News. And that, of course, is something which we would call back to normality. He would try to have a respect as a leader, as a somewhat aloof leader, but also engaged, chummy leader, but someone who really pays attention to the aura of the presidency and the bully pulpit and everything which comes with it. So it would be a much more formal approach, and that is important. And I think it would really relieve the world a lot. And it would, I think, delude the world that perhaps substance-wise a more radical departure has taken place than actually will happen in reality. As I said, Biden's hands will be tight because of Congress and also, of course, because of the next election. They are only coming in 2 years' time, so he also has to bear that in mind. But still, everyone around the world, I think, including China, would probably welcome Biden being more constructive, more civil, more formal. At least he seems to be a man who can be talked to without being emotionally abused. Just ask Angela Merkel or ask Trudeau in Canada or many other politicians, that Trump had no hesitation to shout at them in public and even more so in private. And that is not something leaders do enjoy. So I do think it makes a huge difference.
Thank you.
Professor Larres?
Yeah.
I have a question. The campaign partners for Biden is a female. And also Biden, it's at a high, his older age, his health, and wouldn't say it's bad, but there are certain concerns. But as a female, I just wanted to see how you see if, say something down the road during this 4 years period, if he gets elected, there's some health issues, and then his female runners gonna has to step up to help him run the country. How do you see the policy orientations of her?
I think Kamala Harris was a good choice. She has proven to be a good choice. She is on the ball. She is not extreme or radical. However she has been painted, she's not an extreme left-winger, but she's also not, extreme conservative. She's also fairly in the middle of the Democratic Party, perhaps slightly more to the left than Biden himself. But I think she's very capable. And she, of course, because of her color, because of the color of her skin, but because of her background, her mother is from India, she represents ethnic minorities in the United States. And that has given a boost to many of people who otherwise don't feel represented by either Biden or Trump. Old white men who have been around for many years, be it as businessman or as politician. So someone with apparently more energy, younger, ethnic diverse, has encouraged a lot of people that there is hope in America. It's not just about old white men. And I think that is important. And she seems to be very competent. She, of course, supports Biden, but she hasn't come across as a poodle to Biden. I don't get that impression. She very much has her own point of view, is of course respectful to Biden, hasn't openly contradicted him. You wouldn't expect that in the course of an election campaign. But I think she makes a very nice contrast to Pence, the current vice president, who I think hasn't really gained much respect among the American people. He's seen as a poodle to Trump. He basically nods off everything Trump says. He has never contradicted Trump at all, not even in the most polite way. And Biden is really, I don't think he's very respected at all. And I think that doesn't apply to Kamala Harris. That, of course, depends on how things develop. If over the next 2 years she doesn't develop a certain further competency and is seen as just a nodding poodle to Biden, that can all dramatically change. But I really can't see that. And of course, Kamala is female, and we haven't had too many leading female politicians in the United States at that level. So that also encourages, at least half of the American population. And so I think she was a wise choice. And she was also a better choice to pick someone who is fairly in the middle than someone like Elizabeth Warren, for example, who would have been regarded as much more on the left of the political spectrum. Elizabeth Warren may have thought more deeply about economic issues, may have a better idea about how to reform American society. But I'm sure Kamala Harris will have very good advisors if she manages to get into the vice presidency. So I cannot see that that is a problem. So I'm actually quite optimistic. And if Biden had to step down because of ill health or old age as president, I'm sure she would be a capable successor. I've no doubts at all so far. Of course, the proof is in the pudding. Let's see what happens in the next couple of years. Politicians can, of course, always disappoint us, and many actually do. But I'm optimistic that in this instance, maybe Kamala Harris will not disappoint us.
Thank you so much for your insightful comments. I have a second question, which is also regards a newly appointed female leaders, who is the Supreme Court judge, Dr. Barrett. So from your perspective, the appointment of her, I personally perceive her as a, like more towards right direction. So how do you see her role in the Supreme Court and in the future relationship, not future relationship, in the future politics of the United States?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, interesting question. One issue is, of course, the way she got there. And I think Democrats are justifiably upset about it. It was rushed through the Senate within a week before the election. And that compares very poorly with the refusal of the Senate even to organize hearings for Obama's pick for the Supreme Court. So the way it was all pushed through, I think, really was poor and leaves a very bitter taste in many, among many Democratic politicians. Regarding her person, I think everyone agrees with that. I believe she's highly qualified as a judge. She is an originalist, which means she interprets the Constitution the way it was written many years ago. And that is seen skeptically by more progressive, more modern lawyers. But we knew that. She's a very conservative person. However, as a judge on the Supreme Court, as a judge on the federal courts, any other courts, you are independent. You have been appointed for life, and you also have a personal reputation. You want to leave a legacy. You certainly do not want to go down in legal history as being, particularly after this very tumultuous way she got elected or selected, you don't want to come across as being just the poodle of the president. That Trump put you there and then you just knock off anything he comes up with, even the most bizarre things. Therefore, I believe, like we also saw with the other two Supreme Court judges he has appointed, they are not just nodding off what Trump is suggesting. And they are conservative, of course, therefore they have something in common and they agree with many of his policies, but not everything. They are lawyers, and I think they are Democrats. They do stick to the Constitution. They don't have the ambition to turn the United States into an authoritarian state. With Trump, you never know. You don't really think, people do not tend to think that he is aware of the constitution all that much, that he actually is aware of what democracy really means, that he has authoritarian tendencies. I think it would be unfair to say that about any of the three judges which managed to get onto the Supreme Court because of Trump's support. So my hope is that in the last resort, they will follow the law and will, of course, they will interpret it in a conservative way, but not in a bizarre and authoritarian way. They are Democrats, and so my hope is if something comes to the Supreme Court, which is clearly illegal, which is clearly undemocratic and authoritarian, they will not just go along with it. So what Trump said last night about calling on to the Supreme Court to stop the counting of votes and things like that, I don't think that would find the support of the Supreme Court, including the new judges, if it was clearly illegal and was not supported by any laws and any other regulations. Of course, that is also often a matter of interpretations. And here their interpretation would certainly tend to be on the conservative side, but they would not be authoritarian. They would not try to turn the United States into a banana republic. Trump, I believe, has much less inhibitions to do that. So I think, despite all our criticism, Judge Barrett will have to look at her own legacy, at her own reputation, and what she personally can defend and what not, independent of who got her to the Supreme Court. And Trump will be gone at the latest in 4 years, I would say. Judge Barrett will be on the Supreme Court probably for another 20 years or longer. So, she has to take decisions well beyond and independent of Trump. And she knows that.
Thank you. Very well said. I'm sorry, actually, when during this, your talk, actually, your second conversation for the second question I have, it leads to my third question. I was originally brought up in China. So when you talk about the authoritarian, my perspective about the current Chinese government is a authoritative government.
Absolutely.
So for the future, how will you see through the corporations? I mean, I would like to think like a relationship between two countries as just like a relationship between two persons, okay? So how would you expect it to see the relationship with regardless of who were elected as the U.S. president, just from Xi's perspective, were he willing to cooperate based on his personalities and characters with the Western countries or not?
Probably not. Probably not. My reading of Xi is skeptical. I would hope, and as I said that the ball is in China's court, and that China needs to move and make also concessions. Not unilateral concessions, both sides have to come together, but that means China also has to move. And perhaps China at this stage in time has to move a little more than the Western world, Europe and the United States, regarding economic issues, intellectual property theft, also assertive behavior regarding the South China Sea, Taiwan, and so on. Not to speak of Hong Kong or the terrible human rights disaster which has now been in place for many years in Xinjiang. So I think, China really needs to move. Is China prepared to do that? I cannot see that. Under Xi Jinping, we have seen a rise of nationalism, a rise of great power feeling, a rise of patriotism in China. And the latest 5-year plan, which was only passed a week or so or two ago, also indicates a very ambitious China. And I cannot see that Xi Jinping believes he has to make fundamental concessions. Of course, tactical concessions will be made. There's no way around that. But whether he wants to turn China into a different country than it is now, I cannot see. The role of the Communist Party has always been emphasized by Xi Jinping. And that also means control by the Chinese Communist Party. When we see what is happening in China regarding the suppression of, the increasing suppression of domestic opinion, regarding social media, regarding the Great Firewall, of course, regarding the protests in Hong Kong, above all, and the security law in Hong Kong, what is happening in Xinjiang. These are all indications that Xi Jinping is not becoming a kind of sort of democratic leader or less authoritarian than he has been so far. Actually, the tendency seems to be in the opposite direction, that China is becoming more nationalistic and more authoritarian and more controlling of its own population and of the attempt to control its neighborhood as well than the other way. So the West hoped for a long time, really essentially until 2014, 2015, that capitalism and wealth in China would lead to a democratic development. Not a fully fledged democracy, but at least there would be an opening up. It would become less strictly authoritarian. There would be greater elements of democracy, particularly for the individual citizens in China. And this has not turned to be correct at all. And that was a little bit of a shock to the Western public and to Western politicians. But I think it has now been really recognized that we are dealing with an authoritarian state. We are not dealing with the beginning of a democratic state in China. But we need to still get on with each other. You know, the Western world has often had to deal with authoritarian states abroad. You cannot cut relations, you cannot isolate countries because of their choice of internal government. That choice may not be voluntary, and I wonder how many Chinese would voluntarily pick that government, but on the other hand, Xi Jinping is quite popular as far as we can judge. It's difficult to judge, of course. Many Chinese believe such a huge country like China needs an authoritarian government. Otherwise, it would break away. That such a huge country and 1.4 billion people can only be controlled by a strong man or strong woman, perhaps in the future, in Beijing, not by a democracy. And of course, the current trouble we see, or the turmoil in Western democracies, particularly when you look at the Trump administration, but also some of the incompetence and inability of European democratic governments, look at Britain, for example, to deal with the coronavirus crisis, that only confirms the Chinese leadership opinion that it is much better to have a strong authoritarian government in place because it can deal with the problems of our times. And I would say many Chinese people agree with that. I'm not sure that that is the majority of the Chinese people who agree with that, but many clearly do. And the whole corona crisis and how Western countries really disappointed their own people and the world, how they, well, many of them dealt with the crisis, has really strengthened authoritarianism in China, and also the belief of many people that authoritarianism isn't so bad at all. And this is, of course, in my view, very sad, but understandable. You know, look at China. They had the coronavirus under control, more or less, by April. There's normal life, normal economic life, normal social life has returned, including parties and concerts and going to birthday parties and so on. That has really largely returned to China. Look at Europe, look at the United States, where that has not returned and will not return, probably, as I said in my talk, until a vaccine has been found. So we can expect at least another six months of the same sort of semi-lockdown situation, certainly not normality. And can you blame Xi, say, you know, these guys and their democracy, they are unable, incompetent to deal with the challenges of our times. And many people would agree with that. From my personal point of view, this is very sad. very unnecessary. The Western world should have made much more of an attempt, including, of course, the Trump administration, but also many European countries, including the Johnson administration in London, which has proven among Europeans particularly incompetent, in my view. But that has strengthened anti-democratic feelings and pro-authoritarian feelings all over the world. Therefore, I cannot see that China suddenly says, oh, democracy is much better than our system. Why? You know, it doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. Not to speak about the increasing economic performance in China. They will have growth of between 5 to 6% this year. All Western governments in Western countries, including the United States, will actually have negative growth this year. This is a huge difference. And though that doesn't tempt China's Xi Jinping and other politicians to go for the Western model, unfortunately. I hope in the long run, hopefully already in the medium run, things will improve again so that democracy will again be a role model for the world, both in a social way, but also in an economic way. But right now, it doesn't look like it. But still, we need to engage, whether there's also authoritarianism in China or democracy in China or elsewhere. We need to engage, and that engagement has to happen from both sides. And I think that is realized in Beijing and by Xi Jinping. And I do not see that Xi Jinping is keen on conflict or keen on war, as some people sometimes dramatically say, you know, that war with China is just around the corner. I think this is a lot of nonsense. Both sides realize the danger inherent in that, but sometimes they perhaps go too much to the brink, as, you know, in the recent trade war, as maybe in conflict in the South China Sea or over Taiwan. We should certainly be very careful about going to the brink too closely.
Very well said. Thank you. And the last quick question, I'm sorry, too many questions. There's two candidates right now. Who do you think China would be more preferred in terms of like corporations and maybe?
Difficult to say. Difficult to say. There have been conflicting reports about that. Some people say China preferred Trump because Trump is unpredictable. He's causing chaos and turmoil that weakens America, that weakens the Western world, that gives more opportunity to China to get into that international leadership vacuum. And I think there's some validity to that point. Other analysts have said China actually abhors instability. They want predictability and stability. So at least they can deal with a leader in the West who is predictable. You can at least talk to him. You know what he thinks tomorrow when he, or the day after. It's not changing from day to day. And I think both points of views have some validity to these views. It's difficult to judge. I think in the last resort, Xi Jinping would not be unhappy with either of them. And he's prepared to deal with either of them, and probably quite capable and quite competent. The whole Chinese leadership is to deal with Biden or to deal with a second term under President Trump. Russia, I think, is a different matter. Russia would clearly prefer Trump because Trump has weakened the Western alliance, which is much more important to Russia than to China, because Russia is, of course, a neighboring country. So the weaker NATO is, the weaker the Western military alliance is, the better for Russia. At least that would be Putin's point of view. And Trump has done his best to undermine NATO as no American president before. And so I think it's clear Putin really was in support of Trump. And what we know from what the CIA and other intelligence organizations have told us, the Russians have actively tried with their disinformation campaigns to support the election campaign of President Trump. But with China, I think the question is much more open. You know, there are arguments for both.
Excuse me. Professor, I have a question about China and the leadership. Do you think the leadership worries that if they relax their authoritarianism and became a little more liberal, they'd encounter another Tiananmen Square or that they might have learned a lesson when Gorbachev liberalized the Soviet Union and all the satellite countries began to split and chose democracy?
On the whole, yes, but I don't think that there is any imminent concern for that. The Chinese leadership was definitely very concerned about the protests in Hong Kong, and but they didn't interfere like Tiananmen Square. They waited for a long time and hoped that it would actually peter out. That the bad weather, the winter, and simply people being exhausted by taking to the streets almost daily or every week, that would really gradually make them peter out. When that wasn't the case, they used the pandemic, they used then the national security law to put an end to it quite successfully and without major bloodshed. And that, of course, was their greatest fear, that something like Tiananmen Square, they would have been quite capable of sending in the PLA and really put an end to it, but that would have devastated the image of China all over the world and wouldn't have been good for the Chinese economy either. And they managed, from a Chinese point of view, they managed quite skillfully to really put a lid on the Hong Kong protest without such a dramatic development. Of course, from a Western point of view, it looks very differently, but from a Chinese point of view, it must be seen as quite a success. And that was not clear from the beginning. When these months-long protests took place, as far as I know, Chinese politicians in Beijing were very worried. So China doesn't see any imminent unrest coming up. There are always, actually there are hundreds of unrest, hundreds of protests all over China, usually daily almost, usually for local issues like environmental issues, building issues, of course money in factories and accommodation and so on. But these are protests which are not of national importance. They're not being reported, so they cannot really connect with each other. These are local issues. But there are no imminent issues the Chinese government could be really worried about. In the medium to long term, of course, they are worried about protests. And the most studied history lesson in China is the breakup of the Soviet Union. How economic reforms accompanied by political reforms, how that brought down Gorbachev's Soviet Union. And all Chinese leaders are being indoctrinated that something like that is not going to happen in China. So economic reforms in a very cautious way are possible, but not accompanied by democratic political reforms. That simply is probably one of the lessons from the breakup of the Soviet Union. And Tiananmen Square or something like that, of course, needs to be avoided, both for domestic reasons, but also for international image reasons. And no Chinese politician is interested in bringing something like that about. As I said before, Chinese politicians want stability and predictability, both domestically and outside. But, which Western politician doesn't want predictability and stability? That's natural. You don't want to cause yourself too many problems. But the Chinese state is also very, in a way, insecure about its own people. When you look at the camera system in any big Chinese city, where everyone is closely supervised, when you look at the monitoring of emails and other electronic communication, when you look at the Great Firewall, all these things that indicate there is a nervousness. You have to control your population, otherwise they may actually do something you don't want to do. Also look at Xinjiang. Why do we have these labor camps, or prison camps, as some say, with over 1 million people? And even when people get released, they're still being put in some sort of other kind of milder camps. They're not necessarily allowed to go home. They're in controlled environment. And of course, from a Western point of view, there's no reason for that. We do not see strong feelings for independence in Xinjiang. Even if all that was abolished, Western analysts don't see that Xinjiang is going to rise up and go for independence. But that is not how the Chinese leadership sees it. They want to be ultra careful because they are insecure. They fear that sort of development. but I don't think there's any real reason to worry about that. But China thinks long term, and they certainly want to prevent anything like that starting to happen at a perhaps even a very low level. If that answers your question.
I think we can take a couple of more questions before we, if anybody has any question. Yeah, Oliver, please go ahead.
Thank you. I just checked the latest vote counts. Pennsylvania, Florida, Georgia, Texas apparently go to Trump.
Oh, well.
Not sure, but it looks like it. Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona to Biden. Leave that behind. I believe that there is a problem with diversity in America, which is strange because it's such a diverse society, and also in China. It's funny, Klaus, whenever we meet, we talk about China. China, China, China. Now I sound like Trump. But it's true, China is important, and so is the US. We talk about the two superpowers. China has a problem with diversity, as we can see in Inner Mongolia, in Xinjiang, and in other parts. As you rightfully said, this is part of keeping the nation together, because it would fall apart into several states if they weren't looking after that. But at the same time, it is an issue when you look at how the world becomes more diverse. You know, we were all supporters, or most of us, of globalization, and that has become a no-no in a way, but connectivity is still very much there and will not go away. So if we look at the two superpowers and that diversity problem, as I see it, at the same time, we know that the authoritarians in the world had 4 years to look at Trump and get used to his train of thought, or lack thereof. Is there a possibility that the dynamics change dramatically because they all know who Trump is now?
I'm not sure. I mean, Trump has domestically emboldened the right, an authoritarian tendency in the United States, and internationally has also emboldened leaders like Bolsonaro or Orban or the Saudi Arabian crown prince and other people who have a strong authoritarian, strongman bent. If there were 4 more years of Trump, I cannot see that that will be reversed. It will probably continue. And there seems to be a tendency at the moment that populism and that movement of a more authoritarian, less democratic world is continuing. It has not come to an end. I do think there are phases in world history, phases in world politics, where after a while, certain movements exhaust themselves. Fascism, Marxism, and other movements. And I can't see, unfortunately, that authoritarian populism or the tendency towards that has been exhausted itself, neither in the United States nor worldwide. And we also should look at the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequences of that pandemic. And I think that has further strengthened what was there anyway with populism, coming up 2014, 2015, certainly 2016, then when Trump was elected. And that has been strengthened by the COVID-19 pandemic, because we now talk about bringing back supply chains to our own countries, be it European countries or India or China, particularly in medical gear or in other protective gear. And that is perhaps necessary for health reasons, but it is certainly not a globalizing tendency. Then we talk about 5G issues, where both the United States and in response China want to now focus their supply chains in their own countries or chip making industries. Everything is being brought back home, so to speak. This is an anti-globalizing tendency, and I cannot see that that is going to come to an end in January 2020. What we see is, in a way, more virtual globalization. For example, what we do now, we still talk to each other, but less directly and less engaged perhaps than when we actually meet and can mingle and have a coffee. We do it virtually. So there is, I don't think we can talk about the end of globalization, but it's a scaled down globalization. And that also applies to the economy. I do not think we will have a totally protected economies all over the world. That simply is not possible. We will still continue to trade. And, the United States will not suddenly only trade with itself, or India will not suddenly just trade with itself, or China, despite these countries having huge internal markets. We will still need each other, but it's not as intensive as before. The same applies to, let's say, student exchanges. Of course, students will still continue to travel to other countries and study, but not in the same numbers. It will be a more selective process. And maybe a more elite process because of that, which by its nature is not really a nice form of globalization. It's an elite globalization, but not a more general tendency towards globalization. And that, I think, has all been strengthened by the COVID-19 pandemic. It was there anyway, but now we actually, there's even if we totally disagree with Trump and what he stands for, the pandemic has still made us aware that perhaps we do need some supply chains to be in our own country. And many Democrats would agree with that. Biden said, he would focus on Buy America, which, is understandable from a popular point of view, but doesn't really make sense from a global economic point of view. So I think that tendency will actually continue, encouraged by the pandemic. And I would say in a few years' time, that will also exhaust itself, and perhaps another tendency will gradually rise again, but it will take some time. And I think the next 4 years, be it Trump or be it Biden, will be very difficult years. We will not just, even with a vaccine in, let's say, June 2021, we will not suddenly go back to normal. That hesitation, what has happened, the fear it may happen again, maybe also mutual suspicion, be it justified suspicion, be it totally unjustified suspicion of others, of the foreigner, will unfortunately be with us. And it will take some time to overcome that. Hopefully not a generation, as you like yourself, I very much believe in globalization. I like to travel and I would like to start doing that again, but perhaps we are the exceptions rather than the rule. People maybe have become less interested in travel. And as some friends of mine tell me, well, if I want to travel, I just look at a YouTube video, which I think is not quite the same, but some people generally believe that.
Thank you.
Any more questions? I'm happy to answer a couple of more questions if I haven't exhausted people.
I have one question which
Sure.
I will ask at the end. Maybe I'll give opportunity to others first.
Sure.
Yes, I think I can ask my question.
Okay.
Yeah. See, there is, the world is going from multilateralism to regionalism and to nationalism. When you say America first, or when we say in India, Swadeshi, which is nationalism, what are these, in contradiction with, in contradiction with the reality? Because America first, based on employment, local employment, local factors of production, etc. But the competitiveness, global competitiveness of these economies has emerged mainly from, borrowed factors of production. That is mainly, immigrants, etc. have played a big role in enabling competitiveness of, corporate sector in whether it be in India or in the USA. China China seems to be an exception, but most of the Western countries have benefited from sourcing the factors of production from abroad. So when you say America first, or when you talk about nationalism, is that nationalism going to hurt the very country for which it is meant to augment its welfare?
Well, in the end, yes, in the end, I think it does. To have an isolationist, nationalistic policy focused on yourself may appear to be better in the short run, but I don't think that it helps your economy. When you look at the economies of all large economies in the world, they do need to trade with each other. The best example in Europe is, of course, the German economy. 47% of Germany's GDP is dependent on exports, including exports to the European Union, but also many exports to the United States and China. In particular, to these two big countries. That is an exception. But even in the United States, 14–15%, maybe a little lower, I can't remember the precise figures, are dependent on exports. In other economies all over the world, it often is a figure between 15 and 20%. This is not, let's say, totally huge, but it's not small either. And in addition to the actual trade performance, what also comes into it is the competitive spirit. If you only trade with yourself, then there is much less competition from abroad, much less challenges to you. And when President Trump, for example, announced that the American car industry doesn't have to observe new global emission standards, that might be good at first sight, but of course over the years American producers will lose the competitive edge. They will not have to observe that, so they will not do so in all likelihood, while, let's say, Japanese car manufacturers will do so and will prove to be much more competitive within 5 years on the global market, for example. So I think from a competitive point of view, to keep a know-how edge, you do need competition. We all, personally as also country-wise, we have a tendency to relax and to feel comfortable if we are not being challenged. I think that applies to professors and students, as it also applies to countries. And when there is no pressure on you to be competitive, to be, at the forefront of technological knowledge and advancement, then you do relax and you fall back. And therefore, I think globalization is important and really challenges countries. And the challenge at the moment, which we see from to the United States, is of course mostly from China, but also partially from India, for example, regarding computer technology, pharmaceutical technology, and other artificial intelligence and similar industries. And this is good. Would there be an Apple? Would there be IBM or other leading companies, leading pharmaceutical American companies, if there was no competition from abroad? Probably not. They would probably relax much more and rest on their laurels, so to speak. So I think globalization and trading with each other and being in exchange with each other is also good from that point of view, not just as a sheer trading relationship, but also as a knowledge competition and rivalry, and to bring the world forward in technological goods. And that is, of course, particularly important regarding technology which deals with climate change. We do need better heating systems. We do need better air conditioning systems which pollute less. We do need, of course, better cars which emit less carbon dioxides, or perhaps none at all, with the help of battery-driven cars. Things like that. And would we really push ourselves to develop these technologies if there was no rival on the horizon who seemed to overtake us? I doubt it. And I think that all is getting lost in Trump's America. And I don't think that Trump himself even realizes that. Perhaps some of his advisors realize it, but Trump, as you know, is a very strong personality who it is very difficult to disagree with. And I think most of his advisors keep quiet, despite perhaps their superior knowledge, their superior thinking, they don't dare to come up with these ideas because the president doesn't really approve of it. But in the long run, it will have negative consequences. Unfortunately, that is not what the American public seems to realize, or let's say half of the American public doesn't seem to realize that at this very point.
I think we come to close of this lecture, and I thank Professor Klaus Larres with bottom of my heart for taking his time out, and
Sure.
we will have more of such events, and thank you very much. Thanks to all the participants for being with us and engaging in a very intense discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure, and thank you for organizing it, and thank you for the
My
Krasno
pleasure.
viewers to come on board as well. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much.
Very
Thank you.
insightful. Thanks a
And,
lot.
Thanks a lot.
Goodbye, and I hope to see you again at the next Krasno event,
Sure.
which is on the
Yeah.
12th of November. Let me remind you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing that. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. My pleasure. My pleasure.
Bye.
Thank you. Good day to all of you.
Thank you.
And good night to people in India.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. You know, it's, I mean, virtual globalization is immense. You know, I wouldn't have thought that I could be talking to an Indian audience only a few years back. I thought I would have to travel there, but now I have to save the travel. So to be honest, I would have much preferred to come live and enjoy the nice Indian foods, and nice Indian sightseeing adventures, and the nice Indian people, of course.
Yeah, we look forward to your visit to India.
Good.
Yeah? Thank you so much.
Schedule it in, please.
Thank you, Klaus. Thank you. Thanks a lot.